There's some weirdness about Elsbeth Street that I think might be explainable in terms of Harvey and Lee, even though I'm not absolutely certain about this Harvey and Lee stuff, and I certainly don't believe it's exactly the way that John Armstrong says it is. But that's Harvey and Lee is his thing, of course. So that's what this video is about. I'm going to try to explain the weirdness of Elsbeth Street in terms of Harvey and Lee. And here I have some of the testimony of Mrs. Tobias. She was the wife part of the husband and wife live-in management team at 602 and 604 Elsbeth Street. And it's a very confusing testimony regarding the times involved, so I'm not going to read it, but I'm posting it here for your benefit. If you would like to read it for yourself, you can stop the video on each page and read it. And these are my conclusions as to what Mrs. Tobias says in her testimony, that on October 26th, or just about October 26th, Lee Harvey Oswald came over to view the apartment for rent. On November 3rd, Lee Harvey Oswald came back and rented the apartment, put down a deposit, and paid the first month's rent. And then it's kind of confusing, especially the way Jenner interviews her, as to when exactly she thought they moved in. She, Mrs. Tobias, did see Oswald coming and going occasionally, very quickly, but was under the impression that they had not actually moved in. First she says 2 weeks, and then it's a week to 10 days. I think Jenner says that, actually. But she first says it was 2 weeks, and so that would put it close to November 17th. And that's the day she first saw Marina, and that's the day that she believed they moved in, though apparently she never saw the actual move. We know that Gary Taylor and Oswald rented a U-Haul trailer and moved Marina from where she had been living before to the Elsbeth Street apartment. But apparently Mrs. Tobias never saw that part of the operation. She thinks Marina didn't move in until the 17th. Now, prior to this, Marina had been living with a Mrs. Hall, and an Alex Kleinlerner had been checking in on Marina during Mrs. Hall's absence. And according to him, in this Secret Service report, Marina and the child stayed until November 5th or 12th, 1962. Apparently he knows what day of the week it was, and he knows it had to be 1 week or the other. So this is pretty good. We don't know which day, but it's either the 5th or the 12th that Gary Taylor and Oswald came with the U-Haul trailer and took the stuff and left. And if we look back at what Mrs. Tobias said, we can see that either the 5th or the 12th would work, since she didn't see Marina and didn't think they had moved in until about the 17th. So the move could have been made on the 12th, as far as Mrs. Tobias knows, or the 5th. Now, Gary Taylor is not much help here, as he seems to think that the move occurred in early to mid-October, and I'm pretty sure we can dismiss that as a time. And the FBI investigated this, looking for some hard copy confirmation of the U-Haul trailer rental. It would be nice to have that, because then you could know what day the trailer was rented. But their investigation resulted in speaking to a Mr. Pick at U-Haul. Mr. Pick noted the discrepancies between the receipt they found. They found only one receipt that could have been Gary Taylor's, but said that this was the only record that could be found during the months of October and November 1962 that might be identical. So if a U-Haul trailer was really rented, and it seems like it must have been, the receipt for it could not be found. Now, the official story, as can be pieced together from the accounts of various people, seems to be this, that Marina lived with Mrs. Hall, or in Mrs. Hall's house, from October 7th to November 5th. That on November 5th, she moved, and the official story says that she moved to Elsbeth Street, but apparently immediately had an argument with Oswald and left on November 5th to live with Mrs. Mellor. And this is from Mrs. Mellor's Warren Commission testimony. And in it she says that one evening at about 10 p.m. she got a call from Marina saying that she got beat up by Oswald and she needed a place to go, and that she came over in a cab, and it should be noted that Gary Taylor at this time was a cab driver. And she lived there until November 9th, and then on the 9th she moved in with the Fords, not Gerald, but Duncan. She moved in with Ford and stayed there till the 16th, and then on the 17th she moved in with the Rays, and on that same day Lee Harvey Oswald came over and took her to Elsbeth Street. So here, November 17th, which is the day that Mrs. Tobias says that they moved in and she first saw Marina, that happens to be the day that Marina moved in to stay, at least for a while. So it would seem that Oswald and Taylor must have rented the U-Haul on the 5th and made the move to Elsbeth Street on the 5th. Whether or not Marina ever went there, I don't know, but it seems like the trailer and the move must have happened on November 5th. So that's the weirdness of the move-in to Elsbeth Street. And we have this strange incident here related by Mrs. Tobias here to the FBI on November 24th, and she also covered this in her Warren Commission testimony. Mrs. Tobias advised that sometime around February 1st, 1963, a woman came to her apartment stating she was trying to contact the Oswalds, and she had received a telephone call from Mr. or Mrs. Oswald stating their baby was sick and they did not have money to take the baby to a doctor. Mrs. Tobias accompanied this female individual to the front door of the Oswalds' apartment and rang the doorbell. However, no one answered the front door. Mrs. Tobias said when she then knocked on the front door, and after several minutes, Mr. Oswald came to them, having walked around the side of the building rather than opening the front door. She said she informed Mr. Oswald that this lady wanted to see him, whereupon Oswald opened the front door and ushered her inside the apartment, stating, "I will take care of her," or words to that effect. Now this is bizarre. You have to appreciate how bizarre this is. Oswald did not come out the front door and take the person in the front door. He came out the back door and came around the building, and there's a common hallway for two of the apartments inside the building, and he comes in the door to that common hallway and then takes the person in the front door. There's no reasonable explanation for that. You might think, well, they might have had a sofa in front of the front door, something like that, and they couldn't use the front door. But that's not what this is. He takes her in the front door. So this, I think, is a very bizarre incident, and Mrs. Tobias, of course, remembered it. And here I've illustrated this. The green circle there is the back door. The green line is the path that Oswald presumably followed to go from the back door to the front door. The front door entrance to the interior hallway is where the blue dot is. So someone's knocking on his front door. He comes out the back door, comes around and goes into the front door hallway, and then goes in the front door with his guest. And another fact I'll add here is that Lee Harvey Oswald's address somehow was recorded in certain places as 605 Elsbeth, when actually He supposedly was living at 604 Elsbeth. And here I've circled in pink the street where 605 Elsbeth is on the left, and 602 and 604 are the red rectangle on the right. And in the Warren Commission diagram, the compass points have been mistaken, have been incorrectly put on their diagram, just to confuse us, I'm sure. But anyway, 605 is directly across the street from 602 and 604. And when I went looking for the present-day 605, I found that it was an empty lot. But in 1961 at least, a Mrs. Gertrude B. Roper is listed as living there. Now getting to Harvey and Lee, if there is a Harvey and Lee, and I think there is, Harvey is the one who went to the Soviet Union, and Harvey is the one who married Marina. So, as I say here, Harvey is married to Marina, but Lee is always presented as her husband. Lee has to be presented as her husband to maintain the story that he went to the Soviet Union and married Marina. So to Lee's family, he always has to be presented as her husband, even though Harvey actually is. And I think Lee is always presented as her husband to everybody. That Harvey is the secret person here, but he's the one who's actually married to Marina. So he's the one who wants to live with Marina and wants to have sexual relations with Marina, presumably. And so you can imagine, if this is correct, the hilarious sitcom storylines that might result. And I think that's the explanation for this front door, back door stuff. Harvey is married to Marina, and he's in the apartment with Marina when the guest comes a-knocking. And as I write here, Harvey is inside with Marina when Tobias starts ringing the bell. Harvey leaves by the back door to go get Lee from 605 across the street, because Lee has to be presented as Marina's husband, even though he isn't. And he has to be close by when Harvey and Marina are living together so that Lee can get there quickly and pretend to be her husband. So Harvey goes across the street and gets Lee, and Lee comes back to the front door. He comes from 605, where he's living, presumably renting a room, to the front door of 604 Elsbeth, and takes the guest inside. Lee is presented as Marina's husband. And that is the only explanation I can think of that makes any sense for this front door, back door incident. So I think it's Harvey and Lee is coming across the street to play the husband. So getting back to the apartment rental and move-in date, I think it's Lee that has to rent the apartment because he's the one that's being presented to everybody as Marina's husband. So Harvey can't go rent the apartment. Lee rents the apartment. But the problem is the arrangements have not been made yet for where Lee is going to live while Harvey is with Marina. And I think that's why they have to delay Marina's moving in, because Harvey doesn't want Lee living with Marina because he knows that his wife is a slut, and he doesn't want Lee screwing his wife. So Marina has to go live somewhere else until Harvey can get his room at 605. Harvey rents the room at 605, but at night, when Lee comes home to the apartment, because he has to come home to the apartment to be seen going to the apartment, Harvey also comes to the apartment, and when Harvey gets there, Lee sneaks back across the street to 605, so that Harvey will spend the night with Marina, if you see what I mean. So the story of the November 5th fight is fabricated in order to get Marina out of the apartment while Lee is living there until Harvey can make arrangements to have 605 rented so that Lee can go there at night and he can be alone with his wife.